Let's talk about different ways to migrate data to Google Cloud. Now, I have over here our GCP regions just for an example here. We have several options, and depending on what we need to do, we want to approach this in the appropriate manner to get the result that we need for the exam. And one of the things to point out with this before we get started is it's going to depend on where you're going from and how you want to get to Google Cloud. But also, too, there's different tools and utilities that you could use as well. So let's go ahead and talk about storage in this specific whiteboard. And then another whiteboard, we'll talk about virtual machines, for example. Okay, the first thing I want to cover is how do we migrate object storage from either essentially three different options here. We could migrate from AWS, for example. We could migrate from on-prem, or we could also migrate to another Google Cloud region, for example. So for example, if I want to move my buckets from one region to another, I can do that as well. And the tool in the demo we went through is very easy to do that. I could also move my Amazon S3 buckets to Google Cloud as well. Now, when I consider moving to Google Cloud, I could use what's called the Cloud Storage Transfer Service. So let's go ahead and type that in and make sure we get this. I'm going to go TX and then shorten that up a bit, but that's the Cloud Storage Transfer Service. What about on-prem? Well, guess what? We could use the same thing, right? We could use Cloud Storage Transfer Service there as well. Now, that is only though, let's just keep this in mind, if you have gigabytes of information, Cloud Storage Transfer Service makes sense. But what about if you have terabytes or petabytes of data? Then you may need to consider looking at a transfer appliance. And the transfer appliance you can, of course, request through the Cloud Console, and Google will approve or deny that request based on your relationship with them and if you meet the requirements. So that's another thing to think about. Now, if we want to migrate, for example, from on-prem, we could use what's called an endpoint. If we're going to migrate from Amazon Web Services S3, we're going to use, again, the objects, the bucket that we're going to essentially migrate. And now, if we migrate, of course, to on-prem, either way, it's fairly straightforward. Now, let's talk about another situation. What about if I want to migrate from, let's say, a SaaS provider, for example, to Google Cloud? Well, we can do that. Let's say, for example, we're using Bigquery. And if I'm using Bigquery, the way I could approach this is to use a tool that is part of Bigquery that can move large data sets called the Bigquery Data Transfer Service. So I'm going to call this the Bigquery DTS just for short. That's the Bigquery Data Transfer Service. And this will allow us to automate our data movement from a SaaS platform to Bigquery. And we can also schedule this and make this as non-disruptive to our current setup that we're using in SaaS in production, let's say, to Bigquery in Google Cloud. So we have some choices here to get from another provider on-prem to Google Cloud. So we have a lot of good solutions to think of on the exam. You can certainly expect a few of these to come up. So let's sum this up again. If we're going to go from Amazon Web Services S3, we're going to move our buckets, our objects, right? What are we going to use? We're going to use a cloud storage transfer service. If we're going to go from on-prem, we're going to again use cloud storage transfer service. We're going to typically want to use what's called an endpoint essentially to be able to do that. We could also go from one region to another in Google Cloud. Let's say we want to migrate our storage buckets in US West to US East or vice versa. We can do that essentially with cloud storage transfer service as well. It's meant to migrate data essentially from an online source to another. Now also too, if we don't meet the requirements or if the transfer service is too slow, it's an online service, so just be aware of that. If for some reason our bandwidth is an issue or the amount of time it's going to take, remember there is going to be charges you could exceed going egress and egress depending on what you're trying to do. So just be aware of that. Sometimes it might make sense to get a transfer appliance. This is usually considered the cheapest and fastest option when you want to move terabytes of data. So definitely look at your migration process for the case study, but also for any question you get on the exam, not just architect, but the engineer exam. Also too, on the data engineer exam, there's a ton of BigQuery questions that are going to talk about migration and how to use the data transfer service to automate your data sets, for example. One last thing to bring up as well is we could also, with cloud storage, for example, we could use gsutil. I didn't bring that up, so I want to just touch on that. So gsutil is a command line tool that can perform what's considered basic operations on Google Cloud Storage. Basically, it's good to move files from local storage to the cloud as well. And it allows you to automate it as well. With that said, it's really only meant for a few gigabytes. That's sort of the thing to consider when you're going to move terabytes of data or even petabytes for that matter. All right, so there's a lot here, a lot of moving parts. Let's go ahead and move on.